Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Quest for Truth. Now, last week we had taken a little break from our study in Luke. It was exactly a month away from Signal Boost, and so we used that time to look at Signal Boost. This week we are jumping back into Luke chapter 6. Now, I want to go back just for a minute, and since it's been a couple weeks, and talk about what we talked about a little bit 2 weeks ago. And so what we were talking about was really how we treat others, and not just any others, but really not. Jesus is more concerned about how we treat those who we don't like, who we'd look at as enemies, because we talked about how if they're people that we like or people that would give us something in return, then we would treat them well. But those who would not, or those who we don't like, those who would treat us poorly in return, that's where you have to kind of actually choose to treat them well for receiving nothing in return. And so last week, Jesus had talked about loving our enemies, and he talked about giving mercy, being merciful, and because that's who God is. And as we demonstrate those traits of love and mercy and grace, we really not only show those traits of God to the world, but that is who we become. We become more like God, which is what we're called to do, to become more like him. When we demonstrate God to the world, we become more like him. That's where we left off in Luke chapter 6, verse 36, right? Be merciful just as your Father is merciful. And now we get into kind of the next passage here, chapter verses 37 through 42. Now, this is a little bit of a difficult passage. There's quite a bit going on here, but just keep in mind that this whole passage is talking about the same thing, okay? So as we go through the first couple of verses here, we'll look at them, and then we'll look at the parable that follows, that kind of helps us to understand what Jesus was saying, or to kind of how to live that out, how that actually works. So let's just dive right in with the first couple of verses here. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. And do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Pardon, and you will be pardoned. Give, and it will be given to you. They will pour into your lap a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. For by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you in return. So Jesus starts off here. There's 4 commands here. 2 of them are negative and 2 of them are positive. And so he says, do not judge. And there's a reason, right? There's a result to that, right? Do not judge, so you will not be judged. And do not condemn, that you will not be condemned. So these ideas of really kind of putting other people down, separating yourself from them because you've determined something about them, and so you've cast them aside because of that judgment that you've made, or that condemnation. You've put them down, and you've said they're not, in some way, they're not worthy of something, or worthy of forgiveness because of something that they've either done to you personally or just done in general. But he says, rather than that, he says, do not do those things. Do not judge. Do not condemn. He says, on the other hand, what we should do is to pardon and to give. Now, this verse here, verse 38, has been used, I've heard it a number of times, used to talk about, like, giving. But that's not what it's not what Jesus is talking about here. He's not talking about, giving to the church or giving to organizations or giving to people just who are in need, giving them money or whatever. That's not what he's talking about here. And when you actually read it with the first couple of verses that we read, if you think that's what it is, you might kind of stop and raise an eyebrow and say, wait a minute, what? Because we're talking about judging and condemnation. And then he says, instead of those things, we're to pardon and to give. So what does it mean to pardon first? It means to really to forgive, to really remove a debt. So basically that's saying, you've done this against me, I'll kind of wipe it clean. I won't hold you accountable for that thing. And it says, give, and it will be given to you. Now, like I said when we started, we're talking about the same thing. So he's not pivoting to saying, give people money who need money or a possession, like, if they need clothes, give them clothes. No, we're talking about giving really in the sense of mercy here. We're talking about giving them mercy, giving them grace, giving them forgiveness, giving them, that really freedom from the things that they've done to you. And it will be given in return to you. And they will pour into your lap a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over. For by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you in return. So in other words, he's saying by the measure of which you either judge people or the measure of which you give people grace, that will be measured to you in return. And then he continues, and it's worth noting here before we go on through verse 42, the beginning of 39, and he also spoke a parable to them. So this is connecting, this is Luke, as he's writing, connecting this parable, or it seems some people would say it's three, but it's really a parable, and yet it has multiple aspects to it. But it's connecting this to what has been said just before. So when we have this idea of judgment, condemnation versus, forgiveness and grace, how does that play out? Well, he continues with these parables. It says, a blind man cannot guide a blind man, can he? Will they not both fall into a pit? A pupil is not above his teacher, but everyone after he has been fully trained will be like his teacher. Why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your eye? Or how can you say to your brother, brother, let me take out the speck that is in your eye, when you yourself do not see the log that is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take out the speck that is in your brother's eye. So here we get this idea of not just are we not to judge, but we're to really be careful in our judgments and be careful to make sure that we look in the mirror at ourselves before we go out and try to change or say things about other people. And so he starts off, a blind man cannot guide a blind man, can he? Now in the Greek, some translations kind of word it more like a question. The NASB kind of basically and has translated in such a way that you can really see that the answer to the question is no. Because that's how we kind of do things in English. If you're going to ask a question that basically you're like, the answer is no, you kind of word it like, a blind man can't guide a blind man, can he? Like, that's, of course not. But in the Greek, there is, it's in there that this question, the answer is no. And so, of course, and then when you have the kind of the next question, it kind of clarifies really, and when it says, will they not both fall into a pit? So clearly, if you have a blind man leading a blind man, they'll fall into a pit because they can't see it. They don't have the ability to see what is ahead, and to they're not able to see that there's a pit there, so they will walk into it. And so they really lack this, they lack sight. They're missing sight. And how does that kind of connect to this idea of judgment? Well, it's this idea of, if you don't see, if you can't see what's going on, then how can you judge someone? So, in other words, you have to be able to know what's going on in order to cast a judgment. And it's kind of clarified in verse 40. A pupil is not above his teacher, but everyone after he has been fully trained will be like his teacher. So you have really these three characters here. You have the blind man, or the blind men, the pupil, and the teacher. And so if you're a blind man, you can't see anything. So your judgment will be wrong. But then we have this pupil that is learning, that is growing, that is becoming something. And so they have little bits of knowledge. They might see certain things, but they don't have a full picture. And then you have this teacher that presumably would be able to judge correctly. And so as the pupil or the disciple grows to be like the teacher, he is able to make proper judgments based on having a full knowledge and just a better knowledge of what is actually going on. And then you have the kind of pretty commonly known story of the speck and the log, right? And when you see this, that whole part before kind of makes more sense. When you see, how do you look at the speck that's in your brother's eye, but you don't notice the log that is in your own? So the blind man obviously doesn't see the speck in his own eye, or the log that's in his own eye. And you can think of as this disciple that's kind of starting off and is growing, being like, well, there's making more of the speck that's in their brother's eye rather than the log that's in their own. But then when you kind of come to this maturity, like he says in verse 42, right towards the end, first take out the log from your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take out the speck that is from your brother's eye. And so again, you have that idea of sight, really, and the log that's in your own even is blurring or blocking your vision from being able to help your brother take out the speck. You can see the speck because seeing things in other people is usually a whole lot easier than seeing things in ourselves, even though it's much of a bigger problem, or because we see the whole issue, right? When it's our brother, we might see a certain aspect of it, but when it's ourselves, we see all of it, and we know everything that goes into that sinful action or thought, and so it's a bigger issue, not just because of that, but also because it's us, and because the grace and the mercy that God gave to us should have an impact on us, where we should be looking at ourselves and saying, I should no longer be living that way. And then from there, we can go out and we can, once we change our own actions, we can help other people change their actions. And so that's what's about judging rightly with proper information and having a complete view of things rather than jumping to conclusions and judging prematurely. See you next week.